A message from hell. Growing up, I was raised as a Christian, but I've never really considered myself a particularly devout person. I've lived my life, did my job, went out with friends, and spent time with family, just like I'm sure most of you reading this do. But all of that changed when I died. It happened suddenly, without warning. I was driving home from work when a drunk driver ran a red light and collided with me, killing me instantly. The next thing I knew, I was floating above my body, watching as paramedics tried in vain to resuscitate me. I was dead. But that wasn't the end. In fact, that was just a terrible beginning. I don't remember at what point when I stopped being conscious of the scene of the accident, but the next thing I remember, I was in a dark, foreboding place. Flames licked at the walls and the screams of the damned echoed through the corridors. I was in hell. At first, I didn't understand how I'd ended up there. I had never committed any major sins, at least not in my opinion. But the more time I spent in hell, the more I realized that my life had been full of small, seemingly insignificant sins. Little white lies. Taking home little bits and bobs from work I thought nobody cared about. Not helping people that reached out to me for help when I easily could have. Each one of those little sins had added up, leading me to this place. The torment was unimaginable. I was constantly on fire, but never actually burning or being burned to ashes, but more like fire under my skin. Every moment was agony, and there was no escape. The demons roamed the halls and were sadistic, tormenting me both mentally and physically, and took great pleasure in my pain. I begged for mercy, for a way out of this eternal suffering, but it was no use. I was doomed to spend the rest of my eternity in this hellish realm. But as time passed, I began to realize that my fate was not unique. There were countless others, just like me, who had been sent to hell for their sins. Some were there for murder, others for lying, and still others for blasphemy. All of us enduring the same fate, regardless of how severe we judged our own sins. And as I watched their suffering, I realized that we were all there for the same reason. We had all lived our lives without truly considering the consequences of our actions. We had all been selfish and only considered ourselves in the things we did, and now we were paying the ultimate price. It may be a little late for me now, but hell has taught me a valuable lesson. It has shown me that every decision we make, every word we say, and every action we take has consequences. And sometimes those consequences are eternal. I'm still in hell, and I will be here for all eternity. But my hope is that my story will serve as a warning to others. Consider your actions carefully, for you never know what fate awaits you on the other side. The loft. I always thought I was a rational man, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural phenomena. That all changed when I moved into the old house on the edge of town. It was a charming place with a rustic exterior and an expansive, airy interior. But there was something off about it. Something that made me feel uneasy from the moment I walked in. It wasn't until a few weeks after moving in that I started to notice strange occurrences. Doors would open and close on their own, and I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down I knew that something was amiss. It wasn't until I heard the voice in the loft that I realized the full extent of what I was dealing with. At first, it was just a few faint whispers, barely audible over the creaking of the old house. But as time went on, the voice grew louder, and more persistent. It would taunt me, calling out my name in the dead of the night and urging me to come up to the loft. I was terrified, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. Something about it held me there, kept me trapped in its grasp. I tried to ignore the voice, to pretend that it wasn't real, but it was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. And then, one night, I saw it, a figure silhouetted against the moonlight, standing at the top of the stairs leading up to the loft. It was a ghostly apparition with long, flowing hair and a pale, ghastly face. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. I was frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The figure started to move, slowly descending the stairs towards me. It was then that I knew that it was going to kill me. But then suddenly it stopped. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes gleaming in the darkness. And then, with a sudden burst of movement, it vanished into thin air. I never saw the figure again, but the voice in the loft continued to torment me for years. It would call out to me in the dead of the night, a constant reminder of the horror that I had experienced. I eventually moved out of the old house, but the memories and the terror remained with me. It was a reminder that the supernatural world is always lurking just beyond the veil, waiting to strike when you least expect it. My girlfriend's ghost. It had been a year since my girlfriend, Emily, died in a car accident. I had tried my best to move on, to heal from the pain, and to live my life without her, but no matter how hard I tried, I could never quite shake off the memories, the pain, and the loss. One night, as I sat in my living room, I received a phone call from Emily's number. At first, I thought it was a cruel prank, someone trying to stir up old wounds, but as I listened to the voice on the other side of the line, I realized that it was her. Emily was speaking to me, her voice soft and gentle, just like I remembered it. She told me that she missed me, that she was sorry for leaving me, and that she loved me. It was as if she had never left, as if she was still here with me. I was overjoyed to hear her voice again, but at the same time I was terrified. How could this be happening? Was it some sort of cruel joke, or was there something more sinister at play? As I spoke to Emily, I could feel a sense of unease growing inside me. Her words were comforting, but there was something off about her tone, something that made my skin crawl. And then suddenly, the line went dead. I tried to call her back, but her phone was disconnected. I searched for her on social media, but her accounts had been deleted. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, I was haunted by the phone call. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I started to see Emily's face everywhere, in the shadows, in the corners of my room, in my dreams. And then one night, I saw her again. She was standing right in front of me, her face twisted into a grotesque mask. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. I screamed, but no sound came out. I was trapped, paralyzed with fear, as Emily's ghostly form hovered over me. It was then that I realized that the phone call wasn't a message of love, but a warning. Emily was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me about the horrors that lay just beyond the veil of the living. I never received another call from Emily's number, but the memory of that night stayed with me forever. It was a reminder that sometimes the dead don't stay buried, and that the horrors of the past can come back to haunt us in the most unexpected ways. The Summer Seance. It was a warm summer night, and my friends and I had gathered in my living room for a seance. We had always been interested in the paranormal, and we were eager to see if we could make contact with the spirits that haunted our world. We lit candles and arranged them in a circle around a small table, and then we held hands and began to chant. At first, nothing happened. The room was quiet, and the only sound was the soft flicker of the candles. But then we heard a faint whisper, and the table began to shake. We were thrilled, convinced we'd made contact with the other side. We asked the spirit questions, and it responded with knocks and taps. But as the seance went on, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense. The candles flickered wildly, and the room grew cold. And then suddenly the table began to lift off the ground, as if it was being lifted by an invisible force. We were all terrified, but we couldn't stop. We had opened a doorway to the unknown, and we couldn't turn back now. And then all at once, the candles went out, plunging the room into darkness. We heard a low growl, and then the sound of something moving in the shadows. We all scrambled to our feet, trying to find the door in the dark, but as we groped around, we felt something brushing against us, something that felt cold and clammy, like a ghostly hand. Suddenly, the lights came back on, and we saw something that made our blood run cold. The table was now standing on its side, and etched into the wood was a message: "Get out." We didn't need to be told twice. We fled the room, slamming the door behind us. As we ran down the hallway, we heard a piercing scream, a scream that we knew came from the spirit we had contacted. After that night, I vowed never to hold a seance again. I had opened up a doorway to a world that I was not ready for, a world of darkness and terror, and now I knew that there were things out there that we were never meant to understand or control. Gas station oasis. It was a hot summer day, and I was driving alone on a long road trip through the countryside. I'd been driving for hours, and my gas gauge was getting dangerously low. I knew that I needed to find a gas station soon, or I'd be stranded in the middle of nowhere. But as I drove, the road became more and more desolate. The sun was setting, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and pink. I was completely alone, with no signs of life anywhere in sight. I soon realized I was lost. I had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way, and now I was driving down an endless stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. My cell phone had no service, and I was completely cut off from the rest of the world. I was starting to feel a sense of panic, a feeling that was only intensified by the fact that my gas gauge was now flashing empty. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the world around me became shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from my headlights, and the only sound the hum of my engine. And then, suddenly, my car sputtered and died. I'd run out of gas. I got out of the car and looked around. There was nothing but darkness in every direction, and I was completely alone, and had no idea where I was or how I was going to get away. As I stood there, a feeling of dread washed over me. I knew I was in trouble, and that I was going to have to rely on my own wits to survive. I decided to start walking, hoping that I'd eventually come across some kind of civilization. But as I walked, the world around me grew even darker, and the sounds of the night began to close in around me. I heard strange noises, the sound of footsteps behind me, and the low growl of some unknown beast. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there, but I knew that something was following me, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. As I walked, I began to feel like I was losing my mind. I couldn't tell if what I was experiencing was real or if it was all in my head. I was trapped in a world of darkness and terror, and I had no idea if I would ever make it out alive. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small gas station, its neon lights flickering in the distance. I ran towards it, desperate for help. When I reached the station, I collapsed on the ground, completely exhausted and terrified. But I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I knew that I had survived a nightmare, one that would haunt me for the rest of my life.